We are ready for the second episode in our series on secularism. 4 parts on the roots of secularism. And last week, I teased you with all these generalizations and overviews, and we're going to do this in the next show and so forth. And so today, we're going to talk about the historical links in the chain and go into a little bit more detail on stuff like the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and how we got to where we're going. So today, we're going to look at antiquity, scholasticism, the Reformation, and we're going to stop just before the Enlightenment. And then next week, we're going to take the Enlightenment and go all the way to the 21st century. So, this is very important. Why? Because if you were educated in the West at any point, you probably heard some kind of story like this. You know, once upon a time, there was this beautiful, flowering pagan antiquity. And they had all these great Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, whatever. And then horrible Christianity came in, and it destroyed all of the pagan world, and it was all about blind fideism, meaning, you know, just faith alone and no reason, turn your brain off, whatever. And this led to the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages were so horrible. And then out of it, a miracle, the Renaissance, and then, you know, which means rebirth in Italian, and then Enlightenment, and all this progress. And now we are today with our iPhones and computers and medicine and science. Incredible. Okay. So this story is basically backwards, as we will discuss. Now, a lot of people heard this, and a lot of people, this is how they were taught. Now, if you were taught with a more kind of Christian version of this, especially a Protestant background, you might have heard a different story. And that story could have been something like, well, you know, Christianity was great with the apostles and everything, but then over time it got more and more corrupt, and then there's this evil thing, the horrible Catholic Church, and it became so horrible, and then the Reformation came in and fixed everything. Yay, got Christianity back on the right track. And that story is also a little bit backwards, not completely, but a little bit. And if you're Orthodox, maybe you know all this and you're like, okay, no, the real story is that, you know, something like the Catholic Church added to the faith, and then the Protestant Church took away from it, and it took too much. I've heard this said before, that Catholicism is addition on the faith and Protestantism is subtraction. And so, you know, yes, there were things that the Catholic Church was doing wrong, but the Reformation went too far in overcorrecting it. And I want to suggest that all of these narratives, none of them are really quite right there. And I'm going to be referencing a lot the beautiful book series by Father John Strickland, also published by Ancient Faith, his 4-volume church history series, Paradise and Utopia, because I think that he outlines the story, the actual story of church history, and therefore of the development of Western civilization, in a way that is not really taught in the West, because we have a particular mythology about these things. Our secular Enlightenment mythology depends on a certain reading of history. And if you're a Protestant, your Protestant mythology depends on a certain reading of history, a Protestant reading of history. And this is what this show is all about your imaginative framework. So one way to think about it is that your imaginative framework of the world actually has to be linked to what you might call a mythology, a mythic account. Where did this stuff come from? In other words, like reading history, there's no such thing as reading history neutrally. You read history with a certain perspective of what the meaning of the events are. So for example, if I say to you, how was your day today? You're not going to give me a minute by minute description. Well, my alarm went off at 6:50. I hit snooze. And then at 7, it went off again. So I got up and I took 47 steps to the bathroom to brush my teeth. No, you're not going to say that. That's crazy. And you know I'm not asking that either. And even if you give a less hyper detailed, weird description of it, you know that I'm not asking you about what happened to you as much as I'm asking you, what is the meaning of what happened to you? So you say, oh, I had a great day today. This happened, this happened, this happened. Or you say, I had a horrible day today. What are you doing when you're making that judgment? You're making a value judgment. In other words, you're interpreting the facts. So it's not enough to just state the facts of history. Same thing. You have to give a reading of history. And that reading is going to be informed by, or does inform, your imaginative framework. So that's why it's very important for this episode and the next episode, when answering this question about secularism, we need to answer the question of what happened actually in these periods of history. And I want to sort of demythologize a little bit of either the secular version of this or the Protestant version of this or whatever, because those are the things that we have been taught in this culture. So let me just give you a quick overview of what periods we're talking about. So we talked about ancient, medieval, and modern. And this is the way that we're kind of looking at the history of the West, pagan, Christian, and secular. But within this period, of course, there are sub-periods and things that happen. So the Middle Ages, or the medieval world, whatever, had this particular period, the High Middle Ages, in what's often associated with this term scholasticism, meaning the sort of school era. That's where we get school from. The scholastic era is when the Western Christians, the Catholics, founded the university system. And they founded the university system in part as sort of this outgrowth of monastery schools and scholars copying manuscripts. Everyone came together and started compiling all knowledge, because that's the idea. That's a uniquely Christian idea that we talked about last time, is that if the world is the product of a single rational mind, then the world can be known, it's rational, it can be understood, and so we're going to compile all knowledge. So we get the university system, and that leads to a certain way of looking at the world, which we'll get into. So you have scholasticism. Let's say I'm going to be a little generous and say it's the 11th century, 12th century, and 13th century. And then somewhere in there, you get 12th, 13th century is kind of the peak of that. And then right around the corner is what? The Reformation. So you have scholasticism, the High Middle Ages. Then you have the Reformation in the 1500s. Then you have the wars of religion. And that effectively ends Christendom as a cultural phenomenon. Like the Western world, as informed by and rooted in the foundations of Christianity explicitly, go away. And then after that, you have the Enlightenment, which leads to Romanticism, and then to what we call late modernity or post-modernity, 18th, 19th, 20th century, or 1920, I would say. And then today, here we are in the 21st century. So we're going to talk about these links in this chain over these next two episodes. Today, we're going to look at scholasticism, the Reformation, the wars of religion, and the end of Christendom. Very dramatic, but kind of, actually. So let's talk about scholasticism. We talked a little bit already about the university system and what it was. And I don't think people appreciate, because of this narrative about it being the Dark Ages, I don't really think people appreciate the extent to which these were basically the most rational age in human history, probably. I don't have time, and I'd like to do an entire series on the medieval world, because I think it's really interesting. We don't have time to get into just how insane these people are, but basically the schoolmen, the scholastics, the great teachers of the Middle Ages, they were all genius polymaths, multilingual. They had the Bible and all of Plato and Aristotle memorized. I mean, mostly Aristotle and Augustine. They had all this stuff memorized. They would just quote it all from memory. And they didn't specialize like the modern university system does. They were biblical exegetes. They wrote plays. They did astronomy. They did math. They pioneered new forms of logic. It was completely crazy how brilliant they were. And then you get them all together, and then they're just doing all these brilliant things. Now, why does this matter for us? Because there are two things that kind of start to come to the fore in this hyper-rationalistic, as I'm characterizing it, period of the West. One is that there's this move toward reason alone, meaning reason without reference to revelation, stuff like the Bible, or authority. So, it's easy to say, okay, well, why do we hold this doctrine? It's like, well, the Fourth Ecumenical Council laid it down for us, and the ecumenical councils are guided by the Holy Spirit. They always say, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit. So, okay. So in other words, you can answer an argument by appealing to the valid authority of something like the ecumenical councils or to the Bible or whatever. And it came into popularity at this period in the West that it was better for an argument to be provable by reason alone, without reference to any authorities, to the councils, to the Bible, anything like that. And they said, well, this is a stronger argument, because then you can use it on somebody, say a Muslim, because Islam was now a thing at this time. And if you just appeal to reason itself, then you can convince anybody. Because if I say, well, the ecumenical council said so, and you're not a Christian, you're going to be like, I don't care about the ecumenical councils. Why does that matter to me? And I'll be like, well, you're right. Okay, here's this argument from pure reason that any rational human being can assent to. So they consider these arguments stronger for that reason. And it led to this started with Anselm of Canterbury. And it led to this idea that sort of became the new standard, that in order to prove things, we needed to prove things by reason alone. And we're going to see where this goes with the Enlightenment. But it's important to remember that this rationalistic emphasis didn't start with the Enlightenment or the Renaissance or modernity. It's not a secular idea. It's a medieval scholastic idea. Related to this is the second idea of this move toward thinking of things in terms of intelligences. So in the ancient world, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, people believed that angels and demons had physical bodies, that angels these spirits were made of this kind of gaseous pneuma, is what they called it. And they could be trapped in an idol. You could trap a genie in a bottle, all this sort of thing. And by the medieval period, though, and they also believed, that the pagan gods were real. They were just fallen gods, like in the Book of Enoch. By the medieval period, though, they kind of erased all this paganism in large part from the culture, and people started to forget this. They started to believe that the belief in pagan gods was merely pagan superstition. A lot of people thought this. Or they moved to start thinking about spirits as intelligences. In other words, along with this shift to thinking about things in terms of pure reason and that sort of being the standard, they started thinking about things started to think about spiritual entities in terms of mind. So spirit, pneuma in Greek, means breath or wind, like it's a physical thing. And Origen in the 3rd century says, well, anyone who says that wind is immaterial and thinks that means it has no physical content is dumb, because obviously just because you can't see wind doesn't mean it's not physical. Okay, but by the time we get to the Middle Ages, they're asking questions like, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin? And you've probably heard this. It's been often parodied, but what was the point of this question? And it was a test to get you to think in different categories. And the answer, the medieval answer, is, well, an infinite number. And the reason is because angels are just pure intelligences. So any number of angels can fix his intelligence to focus on this head of the pin. But that relies on this belief that angels are pure intelligences. So in other words, there's different things in the water at this time that are shifting the hyper intelligent, hyper logic and reason centric people, who are the scholars in the Middle Ages, to start thinking in terms of minds, of intelligence as pure minds, quote unquote, pure reason, quote unquote. You start to see this sort of, you might call it a proto-Enlightenment thing going on here. Okay, so what else was going on in the Middle Ages? Well, this is where I want to get back to this Reformation idea. So a lot of Protestants will say, well, the Catholic Church became corrupt and then the Reform happened. The Reformation fixed it all. And a lot of Orthodox people just kind of sign off on this general narrative too, except for the part where it fixed it. They say, well, the Catholic Church went bad in one way and then the Protestant Reformation went bad in another way. The argument that John Strickland makes in his texts, and supports it very well, by the way, with the historical, the evidence that we have from history, is that the Western bishops, the Catholic bishops, were already in a period of reform. He calls them the reformer popes. So a lot of things were going on at this time. Let's jump back a few centuries to the 800s, 900s and stuff. And a little before. So Charlemagne, who we can't talk about in depth now, but he basically, Charles the Great, that's what it means, Charlemagne, but Magnus in Latin, so it's Charlemagne, the Great one. He's great. And he becomes this incredible military and political and cultural leader in the West. And then after his empire starts to break down, it gets fragmented into these weaker, smaller parts. And that's not as strong an infrastructure. So the West is starting to crack a little bit. And then, of course, what happens? You get Norse Vikings invading. They're destroying monasteries like crazy. And that's obviously a huge blow to the West. And then feudalism ends up becoming this sort of social system that successfully takes over the administration of these Western lands. I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit, but basically feudalism became sort of the dominant structure for the episcopacies, the bishopsies, and for parish culture. So all of these things, Christendom in the West sort of reshapes around this kind of feudalistic culture. And there's a lot of corruption with a lot of these bishops because they really, you can't preach against the feudal lord, right? That's a good way to lose your episcopacy, to be defrocked. And a lot of times people would pay big sums of money to the feudal lords in order to become the next bishop. This practice is called simony now. It means paying for your episcopacy. And they do this because, you enjoy all this wealth and power. And so, in other words, there's a lot of things going wrong in the West. There's invasions by pagan Vikings. There's a breakdown of the socio-political order. There's lots of corruptions amidst the bishops and in the papacy, meaning in the Bishop of Rome. So I'm going to give a quote here from Father Strickland's text. He talks about the papacy and says, a string of unqualified popes began to show more interest in the vanities of court life, leading to wholesale demoralization. Pope John the 12th, before dying in the arms of a married lover, meaning a woman who was married to someone else that she was his lover, was said to have turned the Lateran Palace into Christendom's most notorious brothel. Not for nothing has the papacy during this period been labeled a pornocracy. So a lot of things were going wrong. And what this led to is reform, the desire to reform the West by the Western bishops. So this launched the period of papal reforms. And Father John Strickland identifies Leo IX as being kind of the main pope who took upon the mantle of reforming the West. And again, we're going to overgeneralize a little bit. If you're interested, we could do a series on Catholicism and Orthodoxy or just Middle Ages, all that kind of stuff. But to overgeneralize a little bit, the issue here, you might say, from an Orthodox perspective, is that the idea of papal supremacy really started to take off in this period because it was a means for Leo IX, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to exercise his authority over the other bishops. Because remember, there were a lot of corrupt bishops in this period. And for Leo or his delegates to show up and start demanding reform, defrocking bishops, making people repent, changing practices, just coming in by fiat and being like, nope, we're not doing that. Nope, we're firing all those people. It's kind of what Trump and Elon are doing right now. They just show up and they're just like, nope, you're all fired. Nope, we're not doing that anymore. We're overruling this. And people are freaking out a little bit now. So you get a sense of how bishops might have been freaking out back then. But in order for him to be able to do that, it relied on his power as the Bishop of Rome to exercise some sort of supremacy over them. So that was a tool, you might say, again, overgeneralizing, but you might say that papal supremacy ended up being this tool for reform. So now all this reform was happening. And to make a very long story very short, this ended up leading to the famous excommunication of the Bishop of Constantinople by the Bishop of Rome. Not directly, it was through Cardinal Humbert. That's another story. But he excommunicated him, and John Strickland suggests that the Eastern concept that all the bishops are equals, they're equal in the College of Bishops, not in the sense that Rome didn't have primacy, but that Rome didn't have, none of them had supremacy. That's sort of above primacy, right? That's a problem. Because if bishops are all kind of on the same page and no one of them has supremacy, then it doesn't really validate Leo going around and trying to reform all these other bishops by, let's call it, ecclesial force. So you might say that the excommunication of Constantinople by the Bishop of Rome was an extension of this reformational motion of the West. They're going around, they're trying to defrock and reform all of these corrupt bishops, and then they kind of just end up treating the Eastern bishops like they're some of these rogue or corrupt elements. And they had reasons for thinking this, like a lot of crazy heresies had come up and, been suppressed in the East by ecumenical councils. They had been answered. And so then there was the Great Schism. And, that's a story for another time. But what I wanted to touch on is that the main takeaway here is that we call the Reformation, but the fact is that reform was already a project that was going on in the West by the reformer popes, by Leo and the other popes who came after him, who had this project of reforming the church because it was corrupt. So in other words, it's not that the Catholic Church got corrupt and sat on its haunches and then Luther said, hey, we need to stop all this stuff. It's that there was corruption in the West among the bishops, and the popes themselves came to try to reform these things. Now, the problem with some of these reforms, though, so we're going to get to the Reformation in a second, but my point is the reforms were happening already. So the reform was in the air. Okay, so there are three problems with these papal reforms from an Orthodox perspective. One, of course, being the schism. The Bishop of Rome shouldn't be treating the Bishop of Constantinople as though he were some rogue bishop who needs to be brought to heel. That's not the apostolic model for the church. That's what we would say. But there are three outcomes of this period in the West. So one is the loss of iconography. And again, this is another kind of long story. Why doesn't the West use icons the way the East does? Part of it is a misunderstanding by Charlemagne's court. So there was a mistranslation between veneration and worship among the icons. And when the Western bishops saw I guess it was Charlemagne's court, saw what the East was doing, they were like, oh, they're worshiping icons? Put on the brakes. That's no good. And of course, obviously that is no good, but that's not what the East was doing. It was a mistranslation from the Greek to the Latin. So that was a mistake. And so there was this kind of cooling off of iconography in the West. That's why even today you don't have the same kind of emphasis on iconography that you do in the East. And you're like, okay, well, isn't that just a different style? They have statues and statuaries and whatever. And it's like, yeah, maybe. But like, the point is, how did that affect the life of the church? And what Father John Strickland says is that this was part of, because this is a bigger story, this was part of what he calls the loss of immanence in the West. So what is immanence? Immanence is this, because there's two elements to God. There's transcendence and there's immanence when we're talking about the presence of God. So if you believe in a totally transcendent deity with no immanence, that means he's completely somewhere else. He's up there, he made the world, maybe he's not even paying attention. And there's really no way to interact with him. He's totally transcendent. This is what deism is all about. And we're going to talk about deism next week. And then total immanence means he's just completely here. Like, I'm totally immanent to you. I'm just a guy. I'm here. And with the power of technology, now I'm in your ear. But Christianity has this beautiful balance where the transcendent God, because of the incarnation, becomes immanent. He becomes what St. John says, he who we have touched and who we have with our hands and seen with our eyes And of course, the Eucharist, eaten with our mouths, like it's totally imminent, it's totally intimate. That's the scandal and the joy of the incarnation, is that Christ is here with us. And that's what iconography is all about. It's about declaring the fact that God was incarnate, A, and B, that he's manifest in his saints because of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. So immanence is such this vital part of the iconographic tradition. Now, when you remove that tradition, you weaken the immanence of God. And the theory of immanence has two more elements. So one is what we would call savrocentrism, which means cross-centrism. So back to Anselm, who set the course for a lot of this stuff. He wrote this text called Why God Became Man. And he argued more or less that salvation was entirely reducible to the crucifixion. So there's all these elements to Christ's life. There's the incarnation, obviously. There's him being, foretold in the prophets. He's incarnate. He teaches the law. He goes into the desert. He's baptized. He reveals himself in the transfiguration. He dies on the cross. He comes back from the dead. He ascends to heaven. There's all these elements to it. He sends the Holy Spirit down to create the church, etc. But in the West, because of Anselm, in a large part, all of these different elements in salvation really became reducible just to the crucifixion. Now, why that is another story, but let me give you a summary of this from Father John in his text, The Age of Division. So, quote, drawing upon the principles of honor and legal satisfaction current in Western feudalism, because that's what was going on at the time, Anselm argued that Christ's death had not been so much a victory over the devil as an act of satisfying the implacable justice of the infinite God. Gone was Athanasius' emphasis upon the deifying effects of the incarnation, and barely remembered was the glorious outcome of the resurrection. From this point forward, Western concepts of salvation were preoccupied with, and sometimes limited exclusively to, the suffering and death of Christ. The events that most emphasized transformation, the incarnation, transfiguration, resurrection, and ascension, became obscured by this singular act of his passion. So in other words, all these other elements in the saving ministry of Christ have a transformational character to them. The incarnation, God becomes man. Transfiguration, he reveals not only himself, but Moses and Elijah, who are alive with him. There's all these other things going on. Of course, the resurrection. Goodness, Pascha is the greatest day of the year, as you all know. But all these became limited, kind of ignored or minimized or whatever, to the crucifixion. Why? Why would you make that change? And Strickland suggests that it's because the paradigm for salvation changed. It changed from transformation and healing, which were traditional Christian ideas. They're in, obviously, the New Testament, the early church fathers, etc. Chrysostom, St. John Chrysostom himself says the church is a hospital, not a court of law. He says that in the 400s, So what happened? Well, I don't know. There's a lot you could say about there's the influence of feudalism. There's all kinds of things going on in this period, but Anselm shifts to thinking about salvation in legal terms primarily or exclusively. Now, obviously, the legal language is in the New Testament, but it's not the only language, and it's not the primary language either. A good example, just kind of going on a tangent here, a good example is that in the story of the prodigal son, the parable, where is the legal propitiatory element in that? It's not in it. The calf is slain, the fatted calf is slain, and the calf represents Christ, who's slain, the Lamb of God who's slain from the foundation of the world. But it's not to propitiate sins in that parable. It's to celebrate the feast. Totally different paradigm. So my point being, it's not the only or primary paradigm or image in the New Testament. This whole justice. So this part again, an act of satisfying the implacable justice of the infinite God. So God's going to be mad at you, and we need to satisfy his demand for justice. That's a very different paradigm. So that leads to a transformation in the West. And that transformation is toward what he calls savrocentrism, cross-centrism, rather than what he calls metamorphocentrism, meaning change-centric. So is salvation about change, or is it about the suffering of Christ on the cross that propitiates your sins, the end? Okay, that's a Western idea. And one that, spoilers, that the Protestants are going to, for the most part, just wholesale adopt. They're not going to change that framework. They're still working in a completely Catholic framework for salvation most of the time. Okay, so then the third element of this loss of eminence is this whole idea of purgatory and penance. So purgatory, new doctrine at this time, and it ends up being this whole thing, because for the Catholics at this time, what repentance primarily meant was not a change of heart, although that's involved. It primarily meant doing penance. And doing penance meant doing specific things that the priest told you to do. And it was the act of penance that relieved your sin. So let me give you another quote from Age of Division. Again, we're blaming Anselm here. Anselm had presented the salvation of the world in terms of satisfaction, satisfying the angry God, that which the crucified Christ provided before an offended and wrathful God. Remember, it's not about releasing us from the devil or anything like that. It's about this problem with God the Father is sort of the issue here. Nurtured by the writings of Bernard, inspired by the preaching of the mendicants, stunned by the imagery of Giotto, people began to ponder as never before the awful specter of an impending judgment. As they did, penance became a way not only of turning toward God, but of satisfying his anger. Now, you're like, well, what does this have to do with the loss of eminence? I'm glad you asked. It has to do with, because if God's mad at you, there's this separation, right? So the problem is almost by definition that there's something separating you from God, and you need to do something to get it right, or Christ does it, or whatever. But the point is, there's this degree of separation removed from you and God. So that's part of the loss of eminence. And the fixation on the cross and the passion, that's about loss of eminence, because there's this angry God who's somewhere away. He's not here and now. He's somewhere else. He's mad at you. You can't get near to him until this satisfaction is achieved. And this is all part of this loss of iconography. So all of these things together constitute a loss of immanence about God. So God is far away. He is somewhere else. This is part of the drift in Western Christianity. And incidentally, this is probably why we should do a show on the Middle Ages and the popes and all this stuff in East and West. That's part of the Pope thing too. So again, to super overgeneralize, like what's going on with papal supremacy in part, because there are a lot of things going on with papal supremacy, is that the Pope, you see, he's the vicar of Christ. So he controls the Holy Spirit being sent forth. That's part of the filioque. So if the Spirit proceeds from the Son and the Father, or the Father and the Son rather, and the Son, and the Pope basically is the Son on earth, then the Pope really controls when the Holy Spirit goes out and when it's valid or not. So the sacraments have their validity because of the Pope, actually, because of both the filioque and papal infallibility. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we can get into it later. Or you can ask in the chat and maybe we'll get into it more if you care. So this is what's going on going into the Reformation. There's a loss of eminence in the West. There's this fixation on kind of these legal elements, this legal way of viewing salvation and Christianity. And all of that is part of this effort on the reformer popes to fix what's going on in the West. But the way they're trying to fix it is sort of, again, I'm overgeneralizing, but to sort of tighten up the authority of the papacy and sort of, bringing in this legal, you've done wrong, God is mad at you language, because a bunch of the bishops were corrupt. So you start to see how this is all an answer to the corruption that happened after Charlemagne. So with that, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Reformation and then how all of this leads into the birth of modernity. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age, breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Welcome back. I am reading the chat. I am seeing monasteries and monastic orders were the proto-universities, ? Yeah. I mean, you had these monks, and a lot of what they were doing was copying manuscripts. So this is a common misunderstanding that, all the pagan antiquity, was books were burned by the Christians and all this stuff. No, literally the only reason that you have Plato and Aristotle is because Christian monks were spreading literacy by copying these manuscripts from antiquity. That's the only reason we have any of the writings of the pagans, is because monastics copied them, basically. Of the Benedictines in particular, I'm not I'd have to think about that. It's been a long time since I studied the different orders in the West. The Dominicans were not the original guys, but they were very much a spearhead of all of this scholastic stuff, Thomism and so forth. The earliest ones might have been the Benedictines, but don't quote me on that. But a lot of it was not that organized. The emergence of the different orders as well in Catholicism is a really important part of the Western history, how they were started in response to heresies and how the political pressures then informed or guided the formation of these different orders. All very interesting. But, the 1,000-foot view is, that's where monastery schools and monasteries sort of turned into universities. That's the long and short of it, yes. I never quite understood why the West was so much more open to theological reinterpretation or change than the East, which had a stronger commitment to maintaining tradition. Yes. Well, in a sense, the East didn't have a reason to do any of this stuff, right? Like, it's easy for an Orthodox person to say, the Catholics, they added all this stuff. Stupid Catholics, why'd they do that? It was like, well, people don't just do things for no reason. The reason was there was a widespread corruption and problems. And so they needed tools to do this. And one tool to do that in a world that believed in and cherished and cared about authority, which is to a degree that we can almost not imagine in the modern secular world, was to assert the authority of Peter or whatever, and kind of run with this supremacy idea. And that was a tool for bringing all these corrupt bishops to heel. So you have to appreciate why this happened. And also, I'm just going to speculate a little bit here, maybe be a little bit unfair. The Western world didn't have as much intellectual theological sophistication as in the East. The Greeks were all they were all talking about, more people were literate in the East. They were more theologically engaged. Chrysostom was sort of I forget where this was, but he's like making fun of the fact that, he's like, everywhere you went, you went to the bathhouse, you went to the merchants, and you just hear everybody arguing about, all the essence energies of God and all this stuff. Well, that would be later. That wouldn't be Chrysostom's time, but they'd be arguing about, something about the Trinity or whatever. And he's like, everybody just can't stop talking about this stuff. And it's like, you're dealing with a highly theologically literate population. And the West, if you'll remember, we're mostly illiterate barbarians. I mean, the reason that everybody in the West uses the Roman alphabet is because they didn't have a written alphabet. None of these people groups, the Franks, like, they had people, the Norse had runes, I guess, but the Roman alphabet was the alphabet because a lot of these groups just didn't have writing systems, right? Whereas the Greeks had a literate intellectual civilization going back hundreds and hundreds of years, like 1,000 years. So anyway, as usual, there's always more to the story. I never want to, I like overgeneralizing a little bit because it gets us there, but I don't like oversimplifying. So that's why you're going to hear me say over and over again, like, it's a bigger story. Everything is always a bigger story. Okay. We have a lot more to get through. I'm going to try to move through this kind of quickly. And then if you want to, if you're live, great. Thank you for being here. But then later, if you see this, when you see this posted as a non-live video, please comment. Please comment, and I'll try to jump in there and chit chat with the stuff that we didn't get to answer today. So, okay, given what's going on, excuse me, with the West, how then do we understand the Reformation and what follows from it? So, one thing that Father Strickland says is Luther is not really a reformer, he's a counter-reformer, because the reformers start with the reformer popes, and then Luther counter-reforms what the reformer popes are doing, because all these new things, especially the penitential system, which Luther's very upset about, as he should be, I guess, if you want to be generous, that's because of the reformer popes, the reforms of these bishops. And so it's really more of a counter-reformation. And the reason that matters, that distinction matters, is not just like a nerdy gotcha. It's because for Strickland, the narrative is that the West has a uniquely reformational spirit. It's this idea that things are wrong and we can make them better, and that we ought to always be moving toward the better. And that later, we're going to talk about this next week, this is going to cash out into the idea of utopianism in secularism. That's where this is going to go. So what's going on with the Reformation? I really want to talk about two things that the Reformation does. Obviously, there's a bajillion things we could talk about. There's a book called The Unintended Reformation. I think he outlines 6 different facets of what happens with the Reformation, how it affects and is affected by all these different elements of the culture of the time. Very good, giant book, but great. So 2 things I want to touch on because they're relevant specifically for our conversation about where are we going with this towards secularism? How do all these things end up manifesting in the secular world of today? So the 2 things are individualization and the secularization of the state in particular. So let's talk about these briefly. So individualization means that prior to the Reformation, the character of Christendom, and really, I think in pagan antiquity as well, is that your identity is not merely that of an individual. We talked about this the first week. You have a community identity. And part of what that means is tradition, right? It's not just your community is the people alive now. It's your whole people group, your whole clan, your whole race, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Greeks. You have this communal identity that goes through time. And that means tradition plays this incredibly important role in ensuring this kind of continuity through time of who you are as a Greek or whatever. So I'm going to give you a quote here from Brad Gregory, who is a great scholar of all these topics. And he says, the Reformation is the most important distant historical source for contemporary Western hyperpluralism with respect to the truth claims about meaning, morality, values, priorities, and purpose. What does this mean? So Western hyperpluralism is this, it's not just pluralism. It's not that just we believe in lots of different things, because lots of periods in history were pluralistic and that, I don't know, in Alexandria or whatever in the 6th century, you know, there was all kinds of different people groups living there who believed all kinds of different things. That's not what he's talking about. The modern West has a unique hyper pluralism, which means that they just like, you can just make up any and everything. I just talking to somebody who became an ordained minister in the Church of the Gnome, GNOME, like gnomes. And if you get this as an official designation, you are allowed to wear a gnome cap, the little pointy gnome caps, in your government issued ID, because it's a recognized quote unquote religious whatever thing in the United States. And it's like, they don't really think that they're gnomes. It's just kind of, it's very tongue in cheek what they do. But why is that taken that seriously? It's not a joke, such that you can have it as your government issued ID. You can have a gnome cap on because it's your religious right. It's like, that's hyperpluralism, for example. We just can believe anything we want, and we want people to be allowed to believe anything that they want about anything. So that's obviously, you know, that's Western hyperpluralism. That's part of the problem of secularism, is that there's no center and it's all breaking down. But Brad Gregory identifies this as being caused by the Reformation. He says the most important distant historical source, meaning the distant in the past, for contemporary hyperpluralism. About what? Meaning, morality, values, priorities, and purpose, all the things that give life meaning. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons, as usual. But, you know, part of this is that in scholasticism, we lost the sense of immanence of God. So God starts to withdraw. And Protestantism resolves that problem by and large by saying that, well, either by doubling down on it, like with Calvinism, yes, God, you know, in fact, he predestines this person to hell, so don't even try. There's no real thing as functional free will. Okay, that's super loss of immanence, gone. Why did Jesus even become incarnate, you know, if that's what's happening? And then the other way they resolve this is by going inward towards subjectivity. Well, me and my relationship with God, faith alone, my belief alone. All I have to do is believe in God and I'm safe. So it's a private matter between me and God. In other words, it's no longer about community. It's no longer about tradition. It's no longer about the participatory element in life, being as communion, all this kind of stuff. So it leads to spiritual relativism, actually, and not later. A lot of people think that the Reformation, you know, we put things on track and then slowly, it splintered off into all these things. No, immediately, within Luther's lifetime, there was a bajillion competing denominations that believed radically different things about the sacraments, which ones were valid, which ones were fake, etc. I mean, Calvinism and Lutheranism are not compatible at all because of Calvinism's emphasis on depravity and free will and all this stuff, with the loss of free will specifically. So what that means is that theology has to change in two ways. One is that theology now becomes this individualistic, subjective thing, because anyone can just make their own denomination. There's no, like, who is the traditional authority that's going to come here and correct you and put you back on track? Nope, it's not there. That's what it means to get rid of all these bishops and stuff. The other thing that happens is that theology turns into, instead of being the knowledge of God in a participatory way, it becomes about the sort of, I want to say something like a weapon, actually. Like, it becomes this weapon. Like, we're going to do theology, we're going to memorize scripture, we're going to get all these arguments because we need to discern the correct theology from the wrong theology. We need to condemn the wrong theology and identify the right theology. In other words, the Reformation becomes this melee of competing truth claims about which there's no real recourse to anything like, well, the councils say this. I mean, that's kind of it. It's like, nope, everything's up for grabs. And that's a real problem. So the second thing is the secularization of the state, which is intimately related to this problem, which is that suddenly church and state can't really talk to each other. Now, again, we got to be brief about this, but in the ancient world, there wasn't this sense of there was no theocracy. That means the government and the religion are the same. It's that the bishops and the state had different roles, and they checked and balanced each other. And so the whole idea that there could be a separation of church and state made no sense. I think Father Strickland calls it an absurdity, because all the citizens of the state were baptized members of the church. And all the baptized members of the church were citizens of the state. They just go together, right? So the emperor called most of the ecumenical councils, I think all of them. An empress called the last one, but whatever, you know what I mean. So these things go together. They have to go together because it wouldn't make any sense to say otherwise. You'd basically be saying something like, we can separate worldview from how we live our lives. But you can't really live your life without a worldview, right? It just doesn't make any sense. We're going to get into this later. So why does this happen? Well, if religion becomes this matter of individual interpretation, then there's no same page. People are not on board with each other because they're not part of the same religion. You don't have the same religious culture. And that's a really big deal because religion is about what? The questions of ultimate reality. What does life mean? Who are we? What is our purpose? What is good and evil? That's what we're talking about. So if we don't share those things in common, you can't have a coherent state. And you certainly can't have shared religion either. So this leads to war, actually. And so the whole period after the Reformation, we don't talk about this a lot, but it led to like never-ending wars. Well, it finally ended, but just constant warfare between Catholics and Protestants. So I have a quote here from the Age of Division. The wars of Western religion began almost as soon as a viable alternative to Roman Catholicism appeared, meaning as soon as there was Protestantism on the table, in other words, a different religion, wars everywhere. Because it became very valuable. I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit. It became very valuable to earthly rulers to have their own religion, for their own state to have their own religion that was different than the other states. Because if you're Britain and you're Anglican and Germany's Lutheran, you're not really responsible to, neither of you are responsible to doing what the Pope says. So if the Pope condemns your actions, then okay, he's a different religion. It doesn't really apply to us, right? I mean, and the arch example of this is when Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce and the bishops wouldn't grant him a divorce because you don't just divorce somebody for no reason. The church has always frowned on divorce. It's always been very not a good thing. We'll get into that, perhaps. And so, I mean, frankly, Henry just says, well, I'll start my own religion. And guess who's the head of that religion? The monarch of England, i.e. me. So the church gets put under the state. The state becomes the head of the church, right? That's different than what it was before under the imperial model. So anyway, we're going to run through this a little bit, but there were so many things that happened. There was the German Peasants' War, in which Luther called upon the nobility to massacre the peasants. That's a long story. And then there's all these wars between Catholics and Protestants, just constantly fought all over Europe. And the result of this was this idea of, well, after the wars ended, nothing was really solved because they couldn't force each other to become a particular religion. So they came up with this phrase, his region, his religion. Cuius regio, eius religio. So if it's your area, you get to say what religion is in. So what does that mean? That means the fragmentation of Christendom. So it's no longer Christendom. It's a bunch of different nation states with a bunch of different incompatible religions. Good example is the Roman Catholics versus the Calvinist Huguenots. It left 3 million dead, this series of skirmishes and wars. 3 million people died in a fight between Calvinists and Catholics. There was the Puritan English Civil War. Calvinists killed Charles I, and they established a Christian Commonwealth. And he was like, I think we should have a return to tradition. No, the Puritans killed them. They killed them. And Calvinism, we should talk about that sometime. Calvinism, I'm going to give you a quote here from Michael Waltz. He identifies Calvinism as the root of a lot of these issues because he says it's the permanent, inescapable estrangement of man from God is the starting point of Calvin's politics. Because remember, Calvinism, it's like total transcendence, no immanence. And so if that's true, then that's going to affect how we view doing politics, how we view doing government. That's a really big deal. I'll give you an example of Cromwell because it's so horrifying. So Aleister Cromwell, oh no, Oliver Cromwell, excuse me. Cromwell was a Puritan, and Father Strickland calls him a Puritan warlord, basically. And he's going around using force to bring people into line, to destroy Catholics, to establish a Puritan kind of empire. Maybe, I don't know what he wanted to do, but basically, he was leading these military forces into Ireland to crush the uprisings, which were politically motivated. But you know, the flag everyone was waving this whole time was religion, religion, religion. So what happens? I give you a quote. So he goes into Ireland, and one of the first towns is Drogheda, which is this Irish town. And they get there to sack the town and to bring it, to conquer it and to bring it back under Cromwell's iron fist. So this is what Father Strickland says about it. When the town's defenders realized they had no chance against Cromwell's army, they offered their surrender. The Puritan warlord, however, refused to accept it. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to burn Drogheda to the ground, giving no quarter to the men, women, and children it contained. After details of the massacre were reported back to him, Cromwell hailed the massacre as, quote, the righteous judgment of God. So, that should send a little bit of a chill down your spine. Like, people are just murdering each other all the time. And it's like, religion, we will enact the proper religion on these people. Obviously, that's problematic if you're talking about Christianity. That's not Christianity. But, the other thing is that, are these really wars of religion per se, or are they just kind of excuses for the emerging nation states to start defeating their rivals? So the apex of this is what's called the 30 Years' War. And it's basically this all-out war in Europe between Catholics and Protestants everywhere. How it started, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole thing. We don't have time for it. But it ended up just being this incredibly brutal massacre. I will give you a quote. Again, another quote from Father Strickland here. The 30 Years' War marked the near total dereliction of Western Christendom. No previous event, no abomination of desolation had so tarnished its history as the spectacle of Christians murdering each other in the name of the God of love. So this 30 Years' War, I said it was an all-out war between Protestants and Catholics. Actually, the French Catholics took the side of the Protestants. And that should tell you all you need to know about what's going on here. It's not that everyone had this total religious allegiance. It was that these religious identities were valuable proxies for the interests of the emerging nation states. We'll talk about that more next week. So what was the fallout of the 30 Years' War? 10 million dead, about half the population of Germany among them, right? That's insane for the religion of the God of love. Totally insane. Now, therefore, the state becomes secularized. How can it not? Right? So religion no longer is the most important element in how we live our lives. It's now this proxy or this tool for the emerging interests of the state. So the states become secular. Actually, they use this religious thing as a tool, but we no longer have Christendom. You see what I mean? Christendom is this overarching total Christian society, not a society in which religion is reduced to a tool for state power and for state to enforce or to reinforce state rivalry and to endorse and sanction wars between different European states. So this is a complete disaster. And a lot of people mark the end of Christendom at the 30 Years' War, because after that, nothing happened. Really, the only fallout of it was to reinforce this idea of your religion or your region, your religion. Okay, so now what was the point of that? Well, now everybody has a relativized culture. So there's no more Christendom. There's no more unified Europe. There's just all these different nation states. And within those nation states, again, it's not like Lutheran Lutheranism became like, this is Germany forever. No, Germany's secular now. Catholicism in France. Yes, France will go on being Catholic. No, France is completely secular now. And that shows you the proof in the pudding that these religious motivations were excuses. It wasn't an authentic expression of who these people were. And also, it shows you the fruit of the seeds of the Protestant relativism, because more and more groups broke off from each other. This wasn't the end of conflict. More religions would be started within the West. More reforms and attempt at reforms and counter reforms, and all this reformational spirit that started with the reformer popes and continued on through the Reformation. The constant urge to keep reforming leads to constant schism, actually, because you have to get rid of these people who aren't on board with whatever your reform program is. Again, I'm overgeneralizing, but I want you to get sort of the big picture view of why these events were important in creating the secular world of today. Radical individualism, relativism about morality, that's a Reformation Western problem. And then, of course, secularization of the state. Okay, very briefly, I'm gonna jump into the chat right after this, but very briefly, I want to just, so I summed this up. I want to kind of preview where we're going next week, because next week we're going to say, okay, after the Reformation, what happened? We have the Renaissance, we have the Enlightenment, and then we go from there into the 20th century. How did this lay the groundwork for all of that, for all of what's about to come historically? So, here's the thing. Even though everything got secularized, and it's all horrible and all of that, excuse me, Christian Europe still has a Christian imaginative framework, because in a large part, what it means to be European is to be a bunch of pagan tribes that got reorganized under Christianity and became Christendom. So they still have this Christian imaginative framework for everything, but imaginatively. But they've abandoned the centrality of the theology that makes those things so. The example I gave last time was rights, human rights. Oh, humans have rights. It's like, well, what you mean is, and this is the weak version of, everyone's created in the image of God and has radical human dignity. Why? Because of the incarnation. Okay. But if religion isn't really the main thing that holds your society together, if we're not allowed to say what I just said, then we have to invent some sort of secularized version that's going to get us the same results. We want radical human dignity, but without all of the like theology, incarnation, blah, blah, blah. We don't like that anymore. So we have to secularize these Christian ideas, but we still want to keep the Christian effects of these ideas. I'm looking at these notes. I think we're going to save some of this for next week, actually, because I think we've gone through enough of this for now. But maybe I'll just touch on a couple things. So the preview for next time. All of those things we talked about last week, where there are secular versions of Christian ideas. This is the moment in which these things start to change. So the logocentrism, this sort of absolutist or triumphalist view of reason. Reason is the most important thing. Rationalism, the Enlightenment, blah, blah. That starts with scholasticism, and it leads to something we'll talk about next week, this idea of the mechanization of the universe, the disenchantment of the universe. It's not a moral universe anymore. It's an amoral universe. The secularization of the state, that's going to go on to have implications, because we're going to develop a new kind of state in human history, the secular nation state, which never really existed before. That's a new special invention of modernity, and you're going to see why it's a direct result of stuff like the 30 Years' War and the Reformation. And interestingly, which I think is a very important point going forward, it's going to be the cause of utopianism. Utopianism, this idea that heaven can be brought down to earth, that earth can be made into heaven. Because we still have this Christian belief in the kingdom of heaven. That's still part of people's imaginative framework. So, what are we going to do if we no longer put Christianity at the center of our culture? Well, we're going to secularize that idea into this idea of utopianism. And that's also connected to this reformational impulse, the idea that we need to keep reforming and fixing things and making things better and better and better. Well, how about the state? How about the world? How about how about utopianizing society? That's kind of a secularized form of this desire for the kingdom of heaven. And we're going to see that in the nation state. We're going to talk about that next week. I'm both looking forward to it and I'm concerned because it's heavy stuff. We'll talk about the world wars especially and what the 20th century especially did to kind of ultimately end the Christian imagination. And maybe that will help us see what's coming ahead. Let me just check chat real quick. I wanted to answer this question. Do you think the current zeitgeist of re-enchantment will continue as an increasing trend, or do you see it as a short-term blip or fad? Obviously, I don't know what's going to happen. I know what happened, but I don't know what's going to happen. But it's not at all implausible to me that the re-enchantment has to stay in some form or another, because disenchantment isn't possible for mankind. We're always religious. We believe in meaning. You have to believe in meaning. I mean, very few people, I think I've mentioned this, I don't really encounter people who are like, yeah, I really and truly believe there's no meaning to the universe and there are no real moral statements. Morality is an illusion. I encounter people who say that, but I don't really encounter anyone who believes that, right? Because those are the exact people who are going to turn around and say, well, that's just wrong. You shouldn't do this. You know, they become zealots for secular morality and they pretend that that isn't somehow the same thing as a religious morality. Because, of course, when you say that's wrong, you're not saying, I don't like that. You're saying it somehow goes against the cosmic, moral, absolute order of reality. That's what you're saying when you're saying something's evil or something's good or something's right or something's wrong. That's really what you're saying. Because if you're not saying that, then there's no such thing, there's no such thing as moral statements. And I don't really meet people who truly are on board with no such thing as moral statements. Even all these atheist types who get so mad and religion is just fake, it's illusory, science, blah, blah. What do? They turn around and they say, and the other problem with religion is that it's so morally corrupt and bad, and it's done all these wrong things, and the Crusades, the Inquisition, those things are wrong. It's like, oh, really? And where did you get that idea? We'll talk about that more. So, point being, morality itself is re-enchantment. Like, you can't, it's supernatural. I don't like this term, but it's a shortcut. Because when you make a moral claim, you're making a claim about the absolute moral cosmic nature of reality, which doesn't exist on materialism. That doesn't work for materialism. So it's stayed. Re-enchantment has stayed. We just got superstitious about it. Interesting. I don't know if we're going to get to this next week. I hope so. But there's this parallel growth with scientism and science and progress and all these things. Along with that, there's this parallel awakening to an increasing interest in occultism. It's all throughout modernity. Isaac Newton was super into the occult. I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's like, so it didn't go away. We just pretended like it did. And so I think what you're talking about is explicit re-enchantment, where we actually start admitting it and verbalizing it and putting it into the air as something like, oh yeah, it's okay to talk about whatever, karma or fate or morality, but people still talk this way. It's very interesting. Listen to how people talk. They talk in moral terms. So it never went away. Will we establish an institutional, like pan-cultural, acceptable way of talking about it? I don't know. Maybe if we start worshiping AI, I want to do a whole series on technology and occultism. I'm going to put out a poll. You guys can vote on what we're going to do. Anyway, that is enough for today. We're going to have to get into all of this next week, or at least as much as we can. So thank you. Thank you for joining me on this listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. See you next time.